So in this video, I'm going to be talking about nested for loops in JavaScript. Let's start with a quick example of using a for loop. We'll start by declaring a variable which we'll call r. We'll initialize this variable with an array containing the numbers 1 up to 6. Next, we'll create a for loop. So we'll initialize a variable called I, and this will act as a counter for the loop. Then we use a condition for when the loop should stop running. So in our case, we'll keep running the loop whilst I is less than the length of the R array. Lastly, for the updater, we'll say every time that the loop runs, we should increment I. Inside the body of the loop, we'll use a console log to print out the element of the R array, which is at the index of I when the loop runs. Let's run this. The result of this is that every element in the R array gets printed out. Sometimes things can get more complicated. You may find yourself presented with a more complex data structure, such as a nested array. So let's start by looking at what happens when we use the same loop, but with this type of data structure. So we'll create a new array called nested array. And inside this, we'll add 3 arrays. The first array will contain the values 1 and 2, the second, 3 and 4, and the third, 5 and 6. Now we'll add the same for loop again. When the loop runs, we get each of the nested arrays returned. But what if we wanted to access the individual elements of the nested arrays? Well, this is where nested for loops become useful. By using a nested loop, we can access the individual elements in the nested arrays. So let's look at an example of how this would work with our nested array. So inside our for loop, we create another loop. This time, we'll initialize a variable called j to act as the counter. And for the condition, we'll say j is less than array of I dot length. Inside the console log, we'll log out array of I and then the element of j. Let's run this. The result of our nested loop is that we're now able to list out each individual element within the nested arrays. So let's break down what's actually going on here. We already know that the outer loop accesses each of the nested arrays. When this happens, the inner loop goes through each element in the nested array. So the console log is essentially saying, for the array element of I, which for the first subarray is the array containing 1 and 2, then using j, iterate through these elements. Let's break this down a bit further, because it's actually quite complicated to understand. So we'll change our console logs. For the outer console log, we're going to use a template literal, and we'll say, I am the outer loop, and we'll interpolate in array of I. Now let's change the inner loop's console log. We'll say, I am the inner loop, and we'll interpolate in array of I with the element of j. So the first time this runs, the outer loop returns the first nested array, which contains the elements 1 and 2. The inner loop then loops through each of the elements of the nested array in turn. Therefore, we get 1, and then we get 2. This approach can be equally useful if you have an array of words, and you want to loop through each of the individual letters. So let's look at an example. We'll declare a variable called names. We'll assign to this an array. Inside the array, we'll put the strings Abby, Bobby, and Freddie. Now let's just use a basic for loop. We'll set I as the counter. We'll use names.length as the condition, and we'll increment I for the updater. Inside the loop, we'll console log names of I. We get each of the strings, so each individual name, printed to the console. So this is great. But if you want to access the individual elements of the names, so the individual letters, then a nested loop is actually a very useful pattern here. Let's update our code and we'll add an inner loop. So we'll say for we'll set j to 0. We'll say j is less than names of I.length, and then we'll increment j. Let's change the outer console log and we'll say I am the outer loop, and we'll interpolate in names of I. Now let's add a console log for the inner loop and we'll say I am the inner loop, and we'll interpolate in names of I with the element of j. Let's run this. When the outer loop runs, we get the string with the name. When the inner loop runs, we get each individual letter printed to the console. This then repeats for each of the other strings in the array. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe for more content.